the introduction. My name is John Bachler, and I'm a director of the European Policy Research Centre based at Strathclyde University and the Technical University of Delft in the Netherlands. Obviously, in normal circumstances, these seminars would be taking place face-to-face with opportunities for networking and informal discussion, and we're very much looking forward to that becoming possible again at some point later this year. But for now, taking advantage of virtual webinars, we're delighted to have so many people from different parts, not just of the UK, but elsewhere, taking part in this webinar. I'm delighted that we have a presentation by Dr. Alexandra Bulat from Strathclyde University on the question of how local level contact shapes attitudes towards EU migrants based on a comparison of British, Romanian and Polish residents' views in two English local authorities in the context of Brexit. But before introducing our speaker, I'd like to inform you that this meeting is being recorded, which means that you and others will have the opportunity to follow the meeting at a later stage. The recording will be made available on our YouTube channel, and we'll share the link by email. We'd also like to encourage you to use Twitter to share your thoughts on the webinar during the presentation and discussion or afterwards. I'm sure everyone by now is very familiar with the protocol for Zoom meetings, so just very briefly, reminders to keep yourself muted, keep your microphone on mute if you're not speaking. Feel free to use the blue hand function to raise the blue hand if you'd like to make an intervention during the discussion. And please feel free to send questions or comments using the chat function at any point, and we'll try to pick up as many of those points as possible during the Q&A following the presentation. So let me then move to presenting our speaker for today. Dr. Alexandra Bulat is a migration researcher who works at the intersection of academia and migrants' rights work in the UK. She was awarded a PhD from University College London in July of last year. Her PhD research has explored attitudes towards EU migrants in two local authorities in England, Newham and Tendring, in the context of Brexit. And she's now working as a research associate at Strathclyde University on a project run by Professor Tanja Bultmann on Brexit, EU citizens' collective action and the emergence of a European diaspora. Alexandra also works as a co-manager of the Young Europeans Network at the EU Citizens' Rights Organization, the 3 Million. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Alexandra Bulat. Alexandra.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's great to be here and see some familiar faces as well in the audience. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. I'll just try to share my screen because I have some slides prepared for today. I hope it works. So I hope everyone can see this. Yes, I see some people nodding. That's great. So yes, as just said in the introduction, I finished my PhD last summer, and since July 2020, I actually haven't looked back at my thesis. And I was looking back at my thesis whilst preparing this presentation because I thought 6 months passed since I was awarded the PhD. So perhaps it's time, after having a very busy time in the migrant rights sector for the last 6 months before the end of the transition period, I thought that now that I'm back in academia working on this project at the University of Strathclyde that is on EU migrants, as well, it's time to look back at my PhD and actually think about the findings and give this presentation today and really hear your discussion and comments as well on how this PhD could still be used looking forward, even if yes, now Brexit is perhaps in some people's eyes a done and dusted deal. There's still some issues in the thesis that remain very current. So my PhD thesis had this one question at its core, which is how does local level contact shape attitudes towards EU migrants? And today I'll give an overview of the key argument in the PhD thesis corresponding to each chapter, and I'm 100% sure I won't be able to cover even my conclusion chapter in 20 or 30 minutes, but that's what the discussion is for me to give more detail. Especially I'm very keen to speak on the methods and like different ways to take forward this Brexitology type of research in the years to come, because some of those issues still remain very, very current. What the analysis from my thesis consists of two main parts, really. First of all, I was interested to explore this question about how our local level attitudes shaped in those two local authorities that I chose. The first question is, okay, what was the national level picture at that time? And I started my PhD in 2016, September 2016, just a couple of months after the EU referendum on the 23rd of June 2016, and I finished writing my PhD thesis just after the withdrawal agreement had passed Parliament. So in a way, my PhD is in political sociology and migration studies, and provides a sociological picture of attitudes towards migrants and goes into those questions of the different types of contact and how this shapes local level attitudes. But also in a way, it's also a snapshot in the local histories of Newham and Tendring in terms of migration at this time, especially in the time of the negotiations. My fieldwork was in 2017-2018, so really when all the Brexit negotiations, including on migrants' rights, citizens' rights, were happening. So it does provide a snapshot of how people, residents in those local level areas, both migrants and non-migrants, thought about the negotiations and their experiences of Brexit as a more localized phenomenon rather than the national level picture that we see in the media. But the first step was really to think about what was the national level picture at the time. And I found that there were three collections that were unexplored by researchers, three collections of EU referendum ephemera that were at the British Library, at Cambridge, at Oxford University libraries, that really collected all the leaflets, newsletters, different pamphlets, campaign literature from during the 2016 referendum. So I spent some time with all those three ephemera collections, looking at how migration was spoken about during the campaign, who was spoken about, what types of migrants were spoken about in the different campaign literature, but also how was this migration framed. So I'll go on that in a minute. And then the second part was, okay, how did those national level messages translate at the local level, and how does local level contact shape attitudes towards EU migrants? And for this, I did over a year of qualitative comparative research in Newham and Tendring, including 63 interviews with Romanian, Polish, and British residents. Those are recorded semi-structured interviews following the same topic guide, 15 interviews with local politicians, so one MP from each area, and also a few local councillors, and also campaign managers from the Leave and Remain campaign, and people who are very active in the 2016 campaign. Interviews with key informants, those are unrecorded, but key informants who worked with migrants in the area or who advised different campaigns in different capacities, who stayed anonymous, many of them, and also observations in the two areas. So I spent over a year walking in the area, speaking informally to local residents in pubs, cafes. I spent days in a lot of villages around Clacton-on-Sea, for example, just speaking to residents about migration and how they understood Brexit at the local level as well. So I ended up with a lot of data, and I found it quite difficult to actually come up with a picture about how those attitudes are actually shaped. And this is kind of what one of the diagrams I put in my thesis that really summarizes at the very top level and simplifies the argument that is really detailed in each of the chapters in my thesis. So overall, I argue that there are those five main themes in how people speak about migration, about EU migration at the local area. So the 5 C's, as I call them in my PhD thesis: certainty, community, contribution, control, and change. And each individual person relates or understands those themes in a different way and has different experience that will shape how they think about, contribution of migrants and what should migrant contribution actually entail, or whether migrants should in fact contribute in inverted commas at all in order for them to be welcome in society. So this is just a very broad picture of how those themes relate, and I will go into more detail in a minute, but this is what unites all the participants' narratives, and including the themes in the referendum ephemera. Those 5 themes really stood out, and this tells a picture about how migration was understood at the time, and also really unpacks those themes in a way that I will show in a minute. For example, looking at the intersection between skill and ethnic hierarchies in the construction of attitudes towards migrants, the intersection between the national and the local level picture, because a lot of the literature that I analyzed and I read and I put in the literature review, for example, really either sees migration in terms of the national level picture, let's say media analysis of the referendum or media analysis of how migration is perceived in the UK, or there are very many local level studies about with qualitative research, but my study tried to actually examine how the national and the local level actually relate in terms of constructing attitudes towards migrants, as well as how people understand different concepts that are especially in policy terms, and for me, coming from as someone who works in the third sector as well in immigration policy making, those terms that are used quite vaguely in policy without actually meaning much. What does it mean for local people, for local residents, that migrants should contribute? I hear politicians all the time saying migrants should contribute, or we welcome the contribution of migrants. What does that actually mean in terms of people's experiences? What does the term community mean for people? What does control of immigration? We heard throughout the referendum campaign from the Leave side, we need control. How does this control actually, what kind of policies would people actually want to have? And overall, my thesis shows how perhaps there's more of a middle ground opinion than politicians perhaps thought at the time, in terms of when actually asking participants in detail about their views on policy, rather than just having a tick box exercise of whether you want to reduce, increase, or have migration remain the same. If you actually go into the nuances, the picture is much more complex, and that's exactly what my thesis wanted to show. So the my first empirical chapter in the first level really examines the national level in terms of the based on the ephemera analysis. So I came up with 3 main categories answering the question who was spoken about in the campaign, and what kind of migrants were spoken about in the campaign, and how were those experiences framed and communicated to the public. Overall, I argue that campaigners really were cherry-picking specific groups of migrants to suit already decided lines of arguments. So if I already decided that I will make an argument that migration is positive, I will perhaps pick a specific category of migrants to suit that already decided line of argument. But overall, I found 3 categories just based on the text analysis. So I extracted all the text from those ephemera collections that speak about migration, and those 3 categories emerged. So the brightest and the best are the migrants which are seen in the campaign literature as being desirable migrants that should, in inverted commas, that should be welcomed to the UK, and who don't need to be controlled necessarily in that sense. And this category comes up in a lot of the Remain material, but in a very narrow sense. For example, references to academics coming to the UK, or students, doctors and nurses, the types of migration that very few people would have something against, but we'll see that in a minute in terms of the fieldwork. But what this created, the narrow focus on the brightest and the best type of category in the Remain material, actually meant, and I argue this in the thesis, that meant that all the space for discussing the so-called other categories of migrants actually was left to the Leave campaigners to explore and exploit in some of the political arguments. So all the rest of migration, who are not the brightest and the best migrants who are welcome, who are people who are, for example, the so-called, and again, inverted commas, I use those terms very critically in my thesis, the low-skilled migrants are categorized in the rest category, who are less welcome and who are really seen only in Leave material. And then there's also this interesting category of us as the British people in terms of the campaign literature, British people who used freedom of movement, who are also seen in a very positive light. So again, Remain campaign material speaking about British people who use their freedom of movement, and who, in opposition addition to the rest of migrants who need to be controlled in the Leave campaign's view, us, the British people, actually are a positive form of migration, contributing to local economies of EU countries, bringing different cultural benefits and so on. So again, a very positive light. So yeah, there's much more to say on this, but it's just the overall kind of picture. And I also looked in my thesis at just how the different arguments were visualized as well, and how the different campaigns used visuals in more or less effective ways. So this is just one fun example for you to see about the use of maps, for example, and this whole argument about the future EU migration that was very used in the Leave campaign, corresponding to security frames and numbers types of frames in discourses about migration. So there's just one example here. I have a lot more of this. But then what really interested me is to see, okay, so we have this this national level picture in terms of the EU referendum ephemera, with the themes, the different categories of migrants that are spoken about. But then what was really interesting for me in the thesis is how do people, my participants, my British, Romanian and Polish participants in Newham and Tendring, how do they remember the campaign? What arguments stuck to them, from 2016 to up until 2017, 2019, when they were interviewed, and how do they actually react to campaign material? So in each of the interview with each participant, I showed a selection of EU referendum ephemera as stimulus material for the interview. So I showed them the government official leaflet that went to every household. I showed them the widest circulated leaflet, which was this one. I mean, this is an extract, but the one that contained this wonderful map here, and one of the most circulated official Remain campaign materials, and asked them to react, just to comment on them without my intervention, just to look at the materials and comment what they thought about the content, the visuals of it, everything that comes with the leaflet. And here is where I found three main themes, really, which paint a very kind of skeptical and negative picture of how the campaign was interpreted at the local level. So the first main theme in participants' narratives was the lack of trust, mistrust, and skepticism towards the accuracy of information during the campaign. So a lot of people commenting about lies on both sides, about not trusting politicians, that kind of lack of engagement with and lack of trust towards the material. But more interesting are the latter two themes that I found in participants' narrative. One is the inability to relate at the local level. So especially this came out quite strongly in Clacton-on-Sea, in the Tendring area, but also in Newham. Here we have to mention that a lot of the parts of Newham and Tendring are amongst the most deprived areas in the UK, and actually parts of Tendring are in the top most deprived areas in the entire EU. So for example, Jaywick, if you know Jaywick, a village, 5,000 people village in Tendring, is one of the most deprived areas in the entire EU. So there was a lot of discussion around the inability to relate, especially the more positive contributions and positive arguments about migration, to the local level. So this kind of argument that, okay, I may understand this, but how does it benefit me at the local level? And then the third argument was, especially from the part of the politicians interview, but also local residents, about the inability to the lack of a constructive debate on migration. So as I said, there were very narrow economic arguments about the contribution of the brightest and the best in the Remain material, and all the space to discuss all the other many multifaceted and complicated issues about migration was left to the Leave campaign, that also selectively has chosen some groups of migrants to make a more negative argument. However, there was this lack of a local level debate on migration, and it's quite interesting how some politicians told that they explicitly avoided in those two areas, in Newham and Tendring, to discuss migration on the doorstep, because it was considered such a toxic debate. So instead of discussing migration, perhaps debunking some of the myths about migration, or just having a conversation with people and listening to their views, the kind of strategy was more of avoiding the topic rather than engaging with it. And this again created the same effect of the national level picture becoming more stronger, rather than letting local level narratives to be discussed at the local level. And here's just like an interesting quote one of the many interesting quotes in terms of how people react to the material. So I ask, for example, what does EU migration mean to people, and what does uncontrolled EU migration mean to you? And as you can see here, I won't go through the code, but the reactions are completely changed depending on the terminology that you use. And that's something that I explored in my PhD in terms of the political language and how certain word choices actually change the entire perception of of the campaign literature in that sense. So then after I looked at the national level picture and how it related to my participants, I spoke more about, in the interviews, I focused on the local level experiences of people and how they understood migration in their local area, asking them to describe migration in the local area or describe their views or how their views changed over time. And here I had ended up with 3 main chapters that really unpack the themes that I showed in the first slide. So the first one really examines contribution and community as 2 of the themes in attitudes towards migrants, and how those, and here is where the entire discussion about how skill and ethnic hierarchies intersect in the construction of attitudes comes into. I just put like 2 quotes here for illustration, but there's two main narratives that really create an interesting tension in exploring local level narratives. So the first one, which is interestingly amongst my participants, well, a majority view, not only in the Leave supporters, but also some of the Remain supporters in my sample, this entire idea that, of course, we need people of all skill levels, but it needs to be controlled. So the question is, what does control mean, which is explored in the next chapter of the thesis, when I actually asked participants, well, if you were in charge of migration policy, how would this look like? And this really led to some very interesting views that suggest, and that's what I suggest in my conclusion, suggest that perhaps the public opinion, when you go into the nuances of public opinion rather than like a very broad top-down survey, actually perhaps when discuss the nuances, the opinions are a bit closer to a middle ground rather than an extreme policy on both on either side. And on the side of the migrant participants, there was this again, this interesting finding around the downskilling of EU migrants and the perception of EU migrants equal low skill, but not as the entire EU migration. But I have one part of the chapter looks at this, how Eastern European, how low skills, how the term of low skill migration really became in some of the local level discourses as an euphemism for Eastern European migration, as one participant that told in the thesis, as a more polite to say Eastern European, you're saying we don't want low-skilled migrants. So here is where a lot of different opinions and views come together in terms of how Eastern European migration was framed as a low-skilled migration, and it's very difficult to separate opinions based on skill hierarchies to opinions based on different stereotypes of different nationalities that come a lot through the interview material. So then, after looking at the detail of how people understood migration at the local level, I want to explore control and certainty and what people actually mean by control, what kind of policies they want to see, and how does this relate to their individual feelings of certainty, or how certainty or uncertainty, especially in the Brexit context when we're having negotiations at the time, was perceived. So again, I here, because I don't have a lot of time to go into the details of this chapter, but here's like an illustration of a lot of the feeling in Newham and Tendring, given that, yes, as I said, some of those areas are some of the areas that are most deprived in the UK and also most impacted by austerity policies as well. There was a lot of sense of uncertainty of this entire phrase that I also look at critically in my PhD, but being left behind and not being able to translate the positive contribution, the national positive contribution of migration in terms of, let's say, the widely circulated figure of EU migrants pay more tax than they take out, the inability to translate that to local level experiences and how this economic benefit is translated to the local level. So this is how yeah, the kind of main picture was played out in the interviews. And finally, I want to focus this on this a bit more, because the last chapter in my thesis goes back, after all this context and description and explanations, goes back to actually answer the research question, which is about the local level contact and how it shaped my participants' attitudes. So I looked at this chapter explored the various types of contact. So, for example, when people spoke about their experiences of migration, I categorized how they justify their attitudes. So I categorized, they make reference to media narratives, they make reference to politicians' narratives, they make reference to other kind of statistics or like facts and figures, or do they use their anecdotal experiences, and are those experiences local level experiences, or perhaps experiences when traveling, or I had many different categories. And overwhelmingly, like the vast majority, I think over like 80% of, like, when I actually looked at, well, it's qualitative research, but like the vast majority of the explanations only relate to local level anecdotal experiences. So overwhelmingly, people justify their attitudes towards migration or present their attitudes towards migration by reference to one or two anecdotal local level experiences that either confirm or contradict some other kind of more macro level narrative, such as a community media or political narrative in the UK. And this is just an illustration of what I did in this chapter. I looked at case studies for my participants that have quite similar demographics. So in this case, Theresa and Sam, they're both a similar age. They both identify as white British. They both grew up in east of London in Newham, and then moved later on in life to Clacton-on-Sea, and they now live in Clacton-on-Sea. And they both had like quite a similar, worked in similar areas, had quite a similar similar jobs, similar interactions, didn't necessarily travel much abroad, and so on. However, Theresa is very pro migration, and votes for a Liberal Party, and she is very vocally anti-racist, and speaks negatively about people who have stereotypes about EU migration in her local area, including her neighbors, whereas Sam has quite mixed views towards migration, including some quite negative views towards particular types of migrants that he encountered. And then I look in the thesis at what is actually the difference, like how can two people who have like similar demographics, lived in similar places, interacted with similar people, how can they end up having very different views and conclusions about migration? And here's where the local level experiences comes in, because Theresa's local level experiences with Eastern Europeans in Clacton actually contradicted the media and political narratives she heard, whereas Sam's personal experiences with EU migrants in Clacton and wider experience in the UK actually confirmed some of the stereotypes that, for example, he heard from Nigel Farage and like other politicians that he mentions in the interview. I mean, it's more complex than this, but it's just like a snapshot of how this was analyzed. And finally, what I was really interested in, and I spent quite a lot of time in my PhD digging into, is how actually trying to identify how those community media and political narratives intersect with anecdotal examples, and how people actually justify their attitudes when prompted or when not prompted, because some people justify them without being prompted. So those are just like a couple of examples of how in general there's like a kind of a pattern in how people justify their attitudes towards migrants, starting with a community media or political narrative. For example, well, people say that people come from other countries and they put back into the government, they pay their taxes, they pay back into the country, and then it's always like, well, but in my experience or personally, but what I found, well, I got a lot of people that I'm friendly with and they send an awful lot of money back home, so this doesn't necessarily confirm the community narrative that he heard. Similarly here in the other example, hearing negative stereotypes about Romania, but personally Romania is lovely because I got many good friends. I worked with a Romanian, I set up a business with a Romanian. So it's always kind of generalizing from anecdotal local experiences, generalizing those to either contradict or support other narratives that are seen in political or media narratives in general. So yes, I mean there's much more to to this, and this really gets quite complex in in each of those kind of streams of argument. But I think I will end here because I think there's a lot to discuss. There are like many different themes, and I just want to provide like an overview of the thesis. The thesis is already, yes, the PhD is awarded and the full thesis is available. It's open access as well, but I'm really keen to hear people's comments and to discuss this topic rather than me speaking for much longer on this. So I think I'll just end on here. So yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Alexandra. Great timekeeping, but a really thought-provoking presentation, raising a lot of interesting questions. Who would like to start with with comments or questions? I think we can see everybody on screen, so just feel free to raise your hand rather than using the electronic media, the electronic symbols. Who'd like to start? Yes, Bill Roger. Sorry, you're on mute, Bill.
Yeah, somebody's got to be, haven't they? Thanks, John. Thanks, Alexandra. I think that's I love that presentation. I thought it was it brings out some really interesting points that I suppose some of us have almost forgotten. It seemed so long ago. I'm particularly taken by your point about localised contact, and I speak appropriately enough from personal experience on that, where some of the people I know who are most virulently Leave supporters, and I don't know many, I've got to say, were people who came from very affluent backgrounds. A lot of the discussion after the event was on a demographic basis, and they were certainly in the top levels of the demographics. But they did the noble thing of working for Citizens Advice Bureau on a part-time basis. So of course they were coming up against cases where people were struggling, you know, where they're meeting a lot of migrants from wherever. As far as they're concerned, migrants are collectively tarred by the same brush as the people they meet, and that was very damaging, I've got to say, because somebody in a position like that then speaks with a level of authority based on that narrow piece of experience, and it's very difficult for them to generalize that across the piece. I just wondered if you'd given any thought to the implications there. It seems to me there's huge implications for almost almost the kind of the coaching of public third sector staff, public sector staff in putting this sort of contact into context, so that they are not almost themselves for their own mental health as much as anything, to use an overworked phrase these days. But if there'd been any discussion or any thought given to that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a really interesting point, because actually I had a very similar participant, one of my Polish participants, who volunteered at the Citizens Advice Bureau in Clacton-on-Sea, and she was saying about she had quite negative attitudes based on some of the people she encountered there who were migrants and actually needed support. So again, it was one of those cases of participants who was distancing herself from, well, I actually see all the people like who are migrants and seeking support who are not like me, because like I pay my taxes, I contribute, I'm not like the other kind of like distancing yourself from like the other category of migrants. So yes, I think it's quite difficult. It's a good question. It's quite difficult to put into context, because it's exactly one of the things I concluded in my thesis, is because in general the local level experiences were so strong that it was quite difficult for participants to put them into the wider context. It was mainly hearing, let's say, a media narrative about, let's say, Romanians, and whether you have experience with Romanians or not, this experience can confirm or contradict what you hear, and this can actually make it more strongly towards having a negative view or a positive view, depending on how that relationship goes. So yeah, I mean, as a lot of qualitative research pieces, my thesis just makes the argument, as you know, a lot of qualitative research, that it's much more complex than we see in surveys or public opinion polls. So yes, I think it's definitely a good question that I will think about more in that sense.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question, Wilbert.
Yeah, thanks, Alexandra. It was really a great presentation and very rich account of the migrant experiences. And I particularly liked your slide about the misuse of cartography to describe migration flows. But I have a lot of questions, but maybe two that stand out for now. One is the method. So you had a lot of observations and interviews from 2 different areas with 3 different population groups or nationalities. How did you sort of manage to combine, organize, analyze them together, or maybe not together? And the second question, you shortly mentioned that you just walked around and observed, and maybe did you also do like walking interviews? And if so, what was your experience and how useful were they to your thesis?
Yes, thank you. Two great questions. On the methods, I think it was partly how the PhD was structured, because I actually came into contact with those EU referendum collections because shortly after my first year of the PhD, I applied for a placement at the British Library, and it happened to be a placement on analysing EU referendum ephemera at the British Library. And I went and saw similar collections at Cambridge and Oxford, and so I ended up actually including this in my thesis, because firstly, my plan was to analyze, to have the national picture in terms of like media and other political narratives. And there's a lot of literature on this in terms of the Brexit literature on how migration was framed in newspapers, in main UK newspapers, on social media, and so on. But actually after I started experience at the British Library, I realized there was actually no study looking at having like an analysis of the ephemera of the leaflets and campaign materials from during the campaign. And my study is actually the first study looking at a sample of this. There are some references to, for example, the government leaflet that was distributed to every household in some of the books some of the big books on Brexit and as of the referendum. So I started with that analysis of the EU referendum materials and set up the national level picture, and then I actually used those ephemera in the interviews. So it kind of, the continuity between the ephemera analysis in the first stage and the fieldwork is because I actually brought those ephemera in the interviews in my fieldwork and asked people to react to them and really use them as a conversation starter for the semi-structured recorded interviews, but also other interactions in the area. So in 2018, I was walking in Clacton with like what I call the book of Brexit. I had a folder of 100 different EU referendum materials, and I would like just walk around Clacton and Newham and sit down with people and saying, what do you think about this? What do you think about this this leaflet, this argument? It was quite fun to actually get into conversations with people. And in terms of the semi-structured interviews, so all the recorded materials, which were the 63 interviews with the Romanian, Polish and British participants, and the politician interviews, which were not all recorded, but I had very detailed notes following the same structure for the politicians interviews. Those are all analyzed in vivo in terms of their themes through different layers of coding. So those had a more structured approach in that sense. Walking interviews, most of the interviews I did them semi-structured ones that follow the same topic guide. Weren't necessarily walking interviews, but what happened a lot in my fieldwork was that the situation was perhaps more fluid than I expected, because I didn't invite people to do interviews in an office or somewhere else. I went to their villages, to their homes, to their places, and what happened a lot of the time was that I stayed for a very long time with participants. So for example, when I went to Jaywick, I interviewed about 4 participants in the pub. So they were already in the pub, meeting in the pub in Jaywick. I kind of there was an outside table which was actually on the street, not even like on the on the pavement. So like we were on this table like in the street, which was like not very populated, and everyone will come and do the interview there, and then like there'll be more people chatting and so on. And also people worked with me afterwards as well. So for instance, because I was going by public transport or walking, I had a lot of walks with people continuing the interviews, which I then took field notes of, for example, when walking me back to the station or driving me back to the station or just walking around the area. I did ask some participants who are more willing to spend more time to actually show me how do they think migration impacted the area. So I had a few walking interviews in Newham and Clacton, not recorded ones, but I had walks with participants who did the semi-structured interviews, actually walking around different areas and showing me, oh, here's the Romanian shop, or like, here's an area with a lot of Romanian people, and like how they actually understood the area has changed as well. So it was quite interesting contextual information. But yes, that's something that I'm also very interested in, like how can you do more of a structured approach with walking interviews. Not only, I mainly use them as contextual information to contextualize the semi-structured interviews in my case.
Okay, thanks very much, Alexandra. Joe?
Thanks very much. Thanks, Alex. Good to see you. I have a couple of quick questions. So one of those stems from my own experience of interviews. I've done interviews on privilege, and it's definitely the case that my status as a very obviously middle-class person has affected my interactions with people when I'm interviewing them on privilege. And I was wondering whether or not your background, you sense that it ever had an impact on the interviews you were doing and how people were responding to you, and if so, how you dealt with that. And then the second question is about the idea of the paradox of distance. So a lot of what you talked about is how people sort of have dual narratives about a group as a whole, and then the individual instances of that group that they've encountered, and that they don't necessarily align. And that's something that we observe not just in relation to migration, but, the health service is going to pot, but my local hospital's great, or the education service is going to pot, but my local schools are great, or MPs are all terrible, but my MP is great. All of this stuff, right? And I'm wondering whether you engaged with that idea at all, that this is just a particular instance of that, or whether you think it's quite distinct.
Yeah, very good questions. Thank you. Nice to see you again as well after all the PSA events. Yes, on the interviews, I have an entire part of my methodology is just on positionality and how myself as a migrant impacted or not the interviews. And I find I do find like very interesting things, because in some cases, I would say in most of the cases, actually it helped rather than hindered the interview process. Because when I started the interviews, I started with the leaflets, people commenting on the ephemera, and then I asked people like, if you were to guess where I'm from, what would you say? And this actually really prompted a very interesting conversation about stereotypes, because only the Romanian people guessed I'm from Romania. And that was partly because like I said something in Romanian before, and it was very interesting because people would say something like, Spain or France or whatever, and I would say actually I'm from Romania, and they were like either quite surprised, and then I would ask, so why are you surprised, like what was your perception of Romanian people? And this was really kind of led participants to actually to detail more their experiences with different types and nationalities within EU migration. So that was actually helpful. But saying that, I had a very interesting, I think there was this, and there is this stereotype that I encountered, especially when I went to interview Leave supporting people, and I interviewed a few like UKIP supporting people in, Clacton-on-Sea, for example. And of course, I would say to people before I met them that I'm doing this for my PhD research, which is at UCL, and there was this entire stereotype about like, all 100% of academics being for Remain, and people were very surprised when I actually said I didn't vote in the referendum because I wasn't allowed to vote. And this actually I've observed it made people like a bit more willing to speak to me, because I was in a bit of an outsider, that I was not necessarily engaged in the referendum question because I didn't have a vote, and therefore I was perceived to be a bit of a more neutral observer as someone who didn't have a vote in the referendum. But also I didn't obviously mislead people in my identity, but I use part of my identity selectively. So for example, of course, with migrant participants, I would also share a bit about my experience around migration, and this will make participants more likely to share in detail their views. But for instance, when I interviewed Leave supporters, I would say, for example, that my partner, for example, we didn't have the same view on the referendum. So I think this actually very, very much helped, because then I was perceived as someone who actually engages with people with different political views, and this made people more, perhaps easier for them to be honest with me, or saying like, yes, I interviewed a lot of people before, like I heard a lot of negative views towards migration. I mean, I'm not surprised about anything that they're going to tell me. So people were, more likely to be, honest, even people with negative views. When I, left this impression that I wouldn't be surprised about what they're saying necessarily. Yes, on the paradox of distance, I mean, in the last chapter, where I really look into how those community, political, and media narratives intersect to local level experiences, I also look at the one thing I didn't cover in my presentation, because I didn't have a lot of time to go through everything, but I look at how people speak about their change in attitudes, and the difference between what I call a key moment of change in your life, where something happens and you're like, okay, I'll never think this about Romanian people again. This like entirely changed my outlook, which is more rare than a progressive, what I call like a progressive change of like many, many local level experiences actually building up for then the political narrative or the more macro level narrative to be rejected or be adopted entirely. So yes, I think it does have parallels with what you said, but at the same time, I do see a lot of what I was interested in my interviews is actually looking at how people remember change in attitudes, or when their attitudes towards migration change. So for example, I asked, did you always think like this about this particular group of migrants? And people will speak about the different moments in life when their views have changed, and I analyze those. So I would say it's a bit more complex, and I would say that they're not necessarily separate or like necessarily contradictory. Like they're often either adopted or completely rejected depending on local level experiences. But saying that there are also some participants who just do have generally contradictory views towards migration depending on whether they refer to the political narratives or their own experiences. So yes, it's a difficult and interesting question on that.
Okay, thank you very much. A lot of really interesting points coming out of these questions. Georgios?
Thank you very much, John and Alexandra, for a fascinating presentation and a fantastic research, it sounds like. And I've done a little bit of work in this area, interviewing young Syrian refugees and also running surveys of UK citizens around the time of your fieldwork. So in October 2017, we ran an experiment of what British citizens want and how they disentangle all these various categories of migrants, which you correctly pointed out are being blurred. And this experiment found out that indeed citizens want high skills more than anything else. And the second influence was people that are single. Again, supporting this idea that migration should come at affordable costs without dependence. I'm wondering, therefore, and that was my experience when I presented these results at Westminster. I'm wondering, how do we incentivize those that supply the security or the restrictive frames or the leave frames? They care about re-election, and therefore, if they get the sense that the citizens have a specific preference, we can get caught into this vicious circle. So that's one thing. But on the other side, your research makes some fascinating arguments about both how attitudes develop. You've talked about the visuals, the cartography, the metaphors, the exaggerations, the euphemisms, and you highlighted that the facts don't quite correct these misperceptions. But it seems that the key finding here, and I think it's very important, is the quality of personal contact. It's not just seeing immigrants or other people might produce negative attitudes, but having a personal experience and a positive interaction with people from other backgrounds produces positive attitudes. So what is then your key target audience for from this research in terms of stakeholders? Is it policymakers? Is it civil society? What are the policy implications from this kind of research?
Yes, very good question. I do think the thesis has some policy implications, just in terms of the for politicians to policymakers to take into account the nuances in public attitudes, because of course if I asked my participants in Clacton, for example, like, do you prefer high or low skilled migrants, they would say high skilled, like vast majority of them. And even amongst Remain supporters, like I won't necessarily say, I mean, like obviously perhaps it's stronger in the Leave group, but then my PhD actually what was the aim of my PhD is actually to say, what does this term actually mean to you? What does it mean to be high skilled? And often in the interviews, so like I use the interviews to unpack all those meanings. Like, okay, you say migrants need to contribute. What does contribution mean to you? Is it taxation? Is it like other types of contribution? Then, okay, what does low skill mean to you, for example? And it's a fascinating question because I asked all my participants, what does low skill mean to you? And there's no one definition that's the same, and it's definitely not the definition that we use in policymaking in terms of the salary threshold. Only one participant from the 63 people mentioned, yeah, there should be a salary threshold, which is obviously one of the things underpinning the new points-based immigration system. For many people, not a majority, but for many people, low skilled meant someone who is not in work, which is like really fascinating for me. So like, yeah, low skilled is someone who doesn't do anything, who's like just not in work. For, you know, and I think this is a fascinating policy point now relating, of course, my research was in 2017, 2018, the fieldwork, but now in the context of COVID, we see how this, a lot of the people who are labeled as low-skilled migrants are actually now the key workers in the economy. So how has COVID actually changed attitudes? To be like actually fascinated to go back to some of the participants to ask how this changed. But even then in 2018, in the middle of the Brexit negotiations, low-skilled was not necessarily understood. If you dig into the details of how people understand this at the local level, it's not necessarily understood how, you know, how policy understands it. But then the question is like, on what, you know, what is policy based? Because of course, if policy is based on, you know, on surveys primarily, and you can't actually include those nuances in a large scale survey because you just won't have the space, then it will defeat the purpose of, you know, generalizing findings. And, you know, maybe a few focus groups with like key swing voters, then you don't necessarily get to those nuances that you would get if you spend hours and hours in Clacton-on-Sea and speaking to people in the interviews. So yes, there are policy implications in terms of just the thesis show how when you go into the detail and actually ask people for examples and to define the terms that they use from policy, they will not necessarily be, they'll be more in the middle in terms of their views on immigration policy in the UK. Yeah, so I have more to say on this, but I see there are other two questions, so I'll stop on that one.
Okay, thanks very much. Yes, we've got two more questions, one from Fiona Wishlade and one from James Arnott. Fiona first.
Thanks very much, Andrea. That was really interesting, a really interesting presentation. My is a bit about the trends, and when you look at the how important people regard immigration as being, that clearly spiked around the time of the referendum. So you could see that you know, it was an issue that had been weaponized, and I wonder that in your fieldwork, did that come through clearly? And I think that the Observatory of Migration Statistics show that 48% of people mentioned immigration spontaneously in June, around the time of the referendum in June 2016. And then by November 19, that had declined 13%. So your fieldwork was kind of in the middle of that. Did you pick up anything about the change and the extent to which the referendum had succeeded in weaponizing that, or did you have a sense that it was a kind of stable view in your case study areas?
Yeah, that's a good question. The salience of immigration as an issue has been decreasing ever since the referendum, but it's also about like what is in those political media and community narratives at the time. And indeed, my participants remembered in the interviews how there was much more discussion, not only in media and politics and the campaign itself, but also in the local community in terms of community narratives and like how neighbors shared views and news about migration in the 2016 during the campaign, because they were prompted to do so by the fact that migration was like every single day in the news. I think overall how my participants saw migration at the time was mainly about the links the links between migration and the other issues they cared about. So migration was always discussed in the context of, okay, what is the impact on housing or transport or, you know, like local level spending or like other kind of things they saw in the area, or the change in the local area, which is understood differently by different participants. But yeah, I think in a way, of course, they spoke about migration as a main concern because the interviews were about migration, so it prompted them to think about this in more detail. But I would say it was related to wider ideas about community and local level services. So one very interesting quote that I used, like part of one of the subheadings in the chapters when participants speak about their ideal policy towards migration, but also their ideal policy, but also what do they realistically expect from the government. There's this quote from when I was interviewing a family in Clacton in their house who were all UKIP supporters and voted Leave, quite negative towards immigration. And one of the family members said, the government made me prejudice. It's not, it's not migrants or you or anyone else. The government made me prejudice because they didn't invest in my local community, one of the most deprived areas there in Clacton. And therefore, like, now I blame those things on migration because it's the easiest thing that I see and the easiest thing to do. And it was quite interesting quote because the blame was more directly directed, and it's one of the findings in my PhD, that the blame was more directed towards perceived policy failures of successive governments, Westminster governments, the idea of mismanaging migration, which again is understood differently by different participants, and yes, the more positive national level narratives, especially in terms of economic contribution, not translating at the local level. And this, I think, the local characteristics of Newham and Tendring do have a lot to say in this, because it really depends on what areas people were interviewed. So people in Frinton, for example, in Tendring, which is a bit of a more wealthier area, were much more positive and had different priorities than people in Jaywick, for example, or in the council estate areas in Clacton-on-Sea. So yes, again, more to say on that, but that is kind of like just an
okay. Thanks, Alexandra. We're coming up to 1 o'clock, but we've got 2 more questions we can perhaps just squeeze in from James and Samuel. James, first of all.
So did people make a distinction between legal immigration and illegal immigration when you're doing your interviews?
Yes, so the questions that I put to participants were specifically about people coming from EU countries through freedom of movement. So obviously most of the commentary and the views are around legal migration from through freedom of movement and their opinions towards freedom of movement as a system of migration as well. But often, although not asked about this, people did make conflations, for example, with people who they thought come illegally, or as that obviously debatable as well, but like references to refugees, asylum seekers, and what they perceive to be people coming through an unlawful route, even that's not necessarily the case. I think that's also interesting in terms of the ephemera that I analyzed as well, because I looked at the text about what was categorized as EU migration or freedom of movement arguments, and only about 2/3 of the text in the actual campaign material spoke about countries that are currently in the EU, and about 1/3 of the text talk about what was, the future countries that we think will join the EU, like Turkey, like even Syria or Iraq on some of the maps, but also just non-EU countries who probably won't even join the EU in the even in the distant future, but or perceived as like a future migration, which was still kind of like conflated with the with EU migration in some of the materials. But I would say not so much, apart from like a few references of people being concerned about because at the time, especially around the time of the referendum, there was also the EU migrant crisis in the news, which was about refugees being quite prevalent in the news, so people did remember those arguments. But I wouldn't say not necessarily such a distinction as such in the interviews.
Okay, thanks. And one final question from Samuel.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I did some work on migrant entrepreneurship some years back, and spoke with some people in the Highlands. There was business that was employing a hotel that was employing quite a few migrant workers, and I found 2 very conflicting views. they were very happy, the locals, that you had migrants there bringing, you know, some dynamism to the local community and keeping the local school open and local shops open. But at the same time, they were concerned that the local community was changing in the way that it was composed, and there was that kind of cultural purity being corrupted a little bit. And I wondered if you found, you know, those kind of tensions as well, and which ones tended to be stronger.
Yes, I think in both, when I selected Newham and Tendring, I initially selected them as contrasting case studies, because Newham is one of the most multi-ethnic area in the whole world, where only 1 in 5 people identify as white British or white English, and whereas in Tendring 98% of people in Tendring identify as white British or white English. So that's like very interesting kind of contrast. But actually one of the findings of my PhD is that the idea of change and changing the local areas through migration, despite the very different pictures of actually, you know, the number of migrants or the characteristics of migration, was actually spoken in the exact similar way, with references to local level experiences and anecdotes. And I do have a part of the chapter exploring the idea of what does change mean, and what is change in the local community, and this relates to like what participants perceive as like the visible change. So for instance, one of my participants in Newham, speaking about how they went to one of the underground stations in Newham one day after 2004, and suddenly hearing all the Eastern Europeans speaking in Romanian and Polish and so on, and it was their idea of change. Whereas for others, change is literally, you know, one ethnic shop opening in the area. And there were actually kind of some interesting local level responses, some protests in Clacton a few years ago about opening a Muslim community center, and it was actually not open because local residents were protesting against having even more ethnic community centers and religious community centers and businesses there. So yeah, the idea of change is a very interesting one. It's kind of the central thing, because I look at how people's understanding of community control and other different aspects actually relate to the idea to the idea of change. So yeah, I mean, I can say much more on that, but what was actually, I think, the most fascinating for me in the fieldwork was that even in an area, we have an area with high migration and an area of low migration, and still the same narratives of change existed, regardless of whether, you know, in Clacton there are like a few tens of Romanian and Polish people, and in Newham there are like tens of thousands of Romanian and Polish people. So yes, that was like an interesting insight, that the change narrative does prevail regardless of the number of migrants in the area. But also one of the interesting findings as well, now I'll just end on this, is about the speed of change as well, which really came quite strongly in participants' narratives. The idea of having like a very rapid change in migration that changes the area, you know, quite quickly in a couple of years' time, compared to having like a more paced migration that changes the area over time. So people in Newham, for example, compared Commonwealth migration in Newham, how it was like more gradual, and the area had more time to perhaps get accustomed to the idea of change, compared to what was seen as a rapid and speedy change, which was like post-2004 Polish people and post-2007 Romanian people coming into Newham in like a visibly larger group. So that was like another interesting idea that came out in participants' narratives that was explored in the thesis.
Well, sadly, we are running out of time. This has been such a fascinating presentation and discussion, and I think we could quite happily continue for quite a lot longer. But thank you so much, Alexandra, for stimulating that discussion. I'm sure there'll be a lot of us will be looking further into your research, either in the PhD, or I think you talked about publication a little earlier on when we were before the meeting. Just a note that we've got a couple of references that Wilbert, Fiona and Georgios have added in the chat. We'll capture those and ensure that they are distributed with the other material, the recording, and a link to the PowerPoint following this meeting. So thank you Alex, and thank you everybody for your contribution to what's been a really interesting webinar. Just a reminder that our next webinar in this series will take place in 2 weeks' time on Wednesday, March the 17th, when Francesco Mollica, who's the Regional Policy Director at the Conference for Peripheral and Maritime Regions, will present on the Next Generation EU package, subheading question, a threat to cohesion policy. So we hope to see many of you either at that webinar or indeed at future ones in this program. Good. Well, thanks again.